The future of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, faces numerous challenges. Recent developments, including rising tensions with Turkey, have raised questions about the alliance's cohesiveness. This rewrite explores the potential impact of these challenges on NATO, drawing attention to concerns regarding the alliance's evolving roles, expansion, tensions, and NATO's viability. Tensions within NATO become increasingly apparent, particularly in light of Turkey's obstructive stance on Sweden's NATO membership. This divisive issue has found an ally in Hungary, aligning with Turkey's perspective. Furthermore, the recent situation in Israel has exacerbated these tensions, with Sweden consistently siding with the US in support of Israel while Turkey leans towards the opposing side. The question at hand is whether such conflicting dynamics can coexist within a military alliance like NATO. Interview with Patrice Sims. In January 2022, I had the opportunity to interview Dmitry Sims, a distinguished Russian historian, thinker, and political scientist who currently resides in close proximity to my location. During our conversation, Dmitry Sims broached the topic of NATO and expressed my belief that NATO may not survive the ongoing crisis, a belief I continue to hold. This viewpoint requires a closer examination. NATO's original purpose. To fully comprehend the predicament facing NATO, it is essential to revisit the alliance's original purpose. NATO was conceived not as an instrument for offensive warfare but as a defensive alliance with the primary goal of safeguarding Western civilization in Western Europe. However, over time, NATO expanded its scope, ultimately with the aim of transforming Russia into a Western-style nation akin to Sweden or other Western states. This expansion, while well-intentioned, often neglected to consider Russian interests, history, and culture. Expanding roles and evolving challenges. The expansion of NATO's roles over the years has contributed significantly to the tensions we currently witness. As NATO's mission shifted from its original defensive stance to a broader proactive role that began to engage in interventions and missions far beyond its initial mandate. These actions included involvement in various conflicts, security assistance, and nation-building efforts. While these endeavors may have been intended to promote peace and stability, they also stirred geopolitical rivalries and conflicts with nations that viewed NATO's expansion as a threat to their interests. Tensions with Turkey. The current tensions within NATO are exemplified by the rift between Turkey and other member states. Turkey's opposition to Sweden's entry into NATO reflects a complex web of political and regional factors. The Israeli situation has further strained relations with Sweden and Turkey taking opposing positions. The question arises, can an alliance like NATO, which was originally designed to promote defense and security, effectively manage such disparate national interests and foreign policy positions? The future of NATO. The interview with Dmitry Sims sheds light on concerns grounding NATO's future. It is evident that the alliance is at a crossroads. The original mission of defending Western Europe has evolved into a more complex and expansive role, with consequences that are increasingly challenging to manage. The fundamental question remains, can NATO reconcile the diverse interests and foreign policy positions of its member states while maintaining its core mission of collective defense? The concept of civilization has experienced a comprehensive failure, and the repercussions of this failure in Ukraine will profoundly impact the situation. In fact, the entire alliance members of the alliance are privately recognizing that their purpose has become primarily to fulfill our wishes. However, this wasn't the original essence of the alliance. It's important to recall that Eisenhower displayed strong reluctance to join NATO. He was not in favor of it, and he even stated that if NATO were to endure for a decade, this was around its founding, it would have taken us into the early 1960s. Subsequently, we faltered. The whole concept proved flawed because we didn't discover a more effective way to engage with the Soviet Union. This perspective originates from Eisenhower's era in 1955 to 1956. Nevertheless, here we are, and NATO has endured, especially after 1992, largely because we willed it to continue. We convinced our European partners of the value in maintaining it, and they were inclined to agree because they perceived advantages in being part of NATO. They believed it offered them an additional channel to Washington, D.C., a means to extract benefits and goodwill. They also viewed it as a way for the United States to come to their defense, reducing their defense expenditures. Furthermore, NATO cooperation provided opportunities for trade agreements and various other arrangements. Nevertheless, those days are now behind us. Who would want to be a part of an alliance that drags you into a conflict with a nation that poses no threat to you on behalf of another country that holds no relevance to your interests and isn't even a member of your alliance? This is essentially the situation we find ourselves in. It's not a matter of affection or animosity toward Ukrainians or Russians. It's a straightforward observation. So I believe the Swedes should extend their gratitude to Mr. Orban in Hungary and even consider sending a thank you note of sorts to Mr. Erdogan with a postscript saying, "Would you like to have all of our Muslim population?" Yes, I appreciate him every day. However, Swedish politicians, like their counterparts elsewhere, often appear slow to grasp the situation. They are eager to join this alliance, much like their desire to adopt the euro, even though the euro project is faltering. What would NATO membership mean for Sweden, in your opinion? Would it amount to more than just agreeing to host American nuclear weapons, as many would argue? Well, it's true that this would place Sweden under the nuclear umbrella. I have harbored doubts for many years that the United States would risk a nuclear confrontation with a major nuclear power over a small village in Poland or a tiny town in Germany, France, or anywhere else. Such a scenario seems highly improbable. Nonetheless, there's another aspect to consider in all of this, one that carries significant risks. As for the Finns, who might consider rational in the sense that they appreciated the value of neutrality, countries like Sweden had successfully avoided involvement in wars since the Second World War. Joining NATO would never have been seriously contemplated in the past. Yet now they have not only joined NATO but also seem willing to entertain the idea of the US military establishing a base in northern Finland within close reach of places like Murmansk or Archangel. This decision appears to be a disaster. I repeatedly asked them, are Russian forces amassing at your borders? Have you intercepted plans from the Russian General Staff in Moscow indicating an imminent intention to overrun Finland? After all, the last war with Finland went so smoothly for the Russians. Why wouldn't they want to repeat that experience? It's a rather senseless move. This brings us back to the question, why would the Russians want to govern countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, or Sweden? In all likelihood, they wouldn't want the trouble. The Warsaw Pact ultimately became a vanity project, much like NATO has turned into a vanity project for Washington. Now, let's be honest, by the time the British left India in 1947, India had become a vanity project for the British. They were no longer reaping the significant benefits from their colony as they once had, which was one of the reasons for their departure. Their debt-to-GDP ratio in 1947, thanks in part to us, stood at 240. Our current debt-to-GDP ratio is over 102.1125. Some may argue that this isn't extremely high, but consider the context. We are dealing with a sovereign national debt of $33 trillion. If we delved into the details of privately held and foreign-held debt, the realization would strike that this situation is a catastrophe. We are in a very different position now, people. They say we faced problems in the past, like in 2008, 1994. However, the United States is no longer the same nation it once was, and the level of indebtedness is astronomical. We've never confronted this scale of debt before. So anyone in Europe who thinks that joining NATO at this point will bring them substantial strategic advantages probably needs to reconsider. Can't you see Turkey doing the same? The scenario of Sweden's rescue when Russia attacks is unlikely. Once they understand that, they can go there and emulate what their co-religionists are doing. Particularly in a nation with an appealing population like Sweden, they would likely be delighted. However, it remains an absurd notion. Privately, the Turks understand this, and they are essentially paper-only members of NATO, with their views and agendas often at odds with those of the alliance. But the key for us Americans should be maintaining good relations with Turkey, as they are a significant player in the Middle East. That may not always be feasible, but it's a goal to strive for. However, expecting them to be an ally and come to our aid is unrealistic. President Trump highlighted this issue when he visited Japan, questioning why the US was defending Japan when Japan had the capacity to defend itself, and there was no reciprocal agreement for Japan to come to our aid if we were attacked. Americans are gradually awakening to these realities, but they will receive a harsh education when the financial system collapses. In the meantime, the Swedish government should consider holding a referendum, allowing the people to have a say. However, there's a risk that they may avoid such democratic practices.
The NATO alliance has an economic tragedy of the commons aspect to it. Many assume that everyone else will come to their aid, and others will foot the bill for their defense. The US will take care of everyone else, so why bother? But in the end, nobody benefits. I suggest to my German friends that the solution for Germany is to be true to their national identity and stop trying to become some kind of Euro-nation that perpetually seeks to atone for its role in the Second World War, notably NATO. And the Russians? Don't apologize for Stalin. It's time for the Germans to stop apologizing and embrace their own interests. Germans are rational, logical, and reasonable people. They had a maniacal leader in charge for about 12 years, which is regrettable, but that period is over. Germany was a wonderful country before and after that era. Swedes should follow a similar path. Being a nationalist doesn't mean being opposed to others outside your country. It simply means prioritizing the core national interests that matter most to Swedes, Germans, or the French. By all means, they should identify these interests and then decide how much of their security they're willing to entrust to others. This approach would likely yield better results than continuing with NATO, which has outlived its usefulness.